Aran found the redaction on a slow shift, the kind of shift where the deep vault was so quiet she could hear the cooling fans breathing in the walls, and the only other sound was the occasional soft click of the shelf gantries repositioning themselves somewhere in the dark above her head. She was cataloguing old atmospheric logs. Nothing important. The kind of work junior archivists did for the first several cycles of their career, indexing weather patterns and soil chemistry from settlements so old that most of them had long since been folded into larger domes. It was the kind of work that let her mind wander while her hands kept moving, which was exactly why she noticed the anomaly at all. The vault ran 3 levels beneath the Reach's main promenade, cold enough year-round that most staff kept a second layer of wrap folded over the backs of their chairs, and quiet enough that Ket had long ago stopped noticing the hum of the climate regulators except in moments like this one, when something in the silence changed just slightly and her attention followed it before she'd consciously decided to look. The index threw up a header she didn't recognize, buried 3 layers deep in a cross-reference chain she'd only opened because a soil report had cited it once, in passing, the way old documents sometimes cite things nobody has looked at in generations. She almost skipped past it. Something made her stop. Esh archife, Terran origin. Cross-reference candidate. Grey Wither event, cycle 300. Under it, 1 line, in the flat administrative font the long shelf used for every denial, from the trivial to the deadly serious. Denied. Continuity breach risk. Access restricted by order of the Council. No content. No summary. No explanation of what the file might once have held, or why a 300-cycle-old cross-reference would still be dangerous enough to lock behind a wall this thick. Ket had cracked open denial tags before, mostly by accident, mostly things that turned out to be mundane once she found a way around them. An old census dispute, a border argument nobody living still cared about. This one felt different from the first moment she saw it. It made the hair along her collar ridge stand up, in a way she didn't yet have words for. She typed a soft query, careful, the kind of query that wouldn't ring any alarms if anyone happened to be watching activity logs that evening. Define. Grey Wither. The system returned nothing. Not restricted. Not denied. Simply nothing, as though the word had never been typed into any Senish database in the entire 10,000 years of its existence. That, more than the redaction itself, was what made her chest go tight. A denial meant someone, once, had decided a thing was dangerous enough to lock away. An absence like this meant someone had decided, further back still, that the question itself should never have had anywhere to land. She sat very still for a long moment, staring at the empty search field, feeling the particular cold of realizing that someone had worked very hard, a very long time ago, to make sure nobody ever felt exactly what she was feeling right now. Across the vault, at the next terminal, her colleague ISS Doran glanced over without looking up from her own work. You've made the face again. What face? The one you make right before you disappear down a research hole for 6 hours, and I have to cover your reshelving quota. ISS finally looked over properly, catching sight of Ket's screen, the flat grey denial banner still glowing there. She went quiet for a second. That's an old lock. Older than the standard template, even. Whatever that is, somebody wanted it forgotten before either of us was born. That's what I thought too. Then maybe leave it forgotten, ISS said, not unkindly, turning back to her own console. Some shelves are dusty for a reason. That's what worries me, Ket said. I've cracked open old denial tags before. Usually there's a category behind them. Weapons, medical, political dispute. This one has no category at all. Whoever built this lock wasn't hiding a secret. They were hiding the fact that there was ever a secret to hide. ISS gave her a long, appraising look, the kind old friends give each other when they can already tell where a conversation is heading and would rather it didn't. You're going to pull the thread anyway, aren't you? Probably. Then at least don't tell me the details until you've already done something I can't be blamed for, ISS said, and went back to her own cataloguing with the specific, determined focus of someone choosing quite deliberately not to ask a second question. Ket walked the long way back to her own terminal afterward, past shelf after shelf of quiet grey casings, each one holding some fragment of 10,000 years of Senish memory, most of it untouched by anyone still living. She had always found the vault comforting before that evening, the sense of everything kept, everything accounted for, nothing truly lost. For the first time, walking those same familiar aisles, she found herself wondering how much of what she'd always assumed was kept had actually just been folded quietly out of sight, the outer shape of it left standing, the contents removed. Ket didn't answer. Her wrist unit chimed with a priority alert from the surface before she had to decide whether she agreed. Priority alerts from the surface were usually agricultural quota disputes, or weather advisories, the ordinary background noise of a colony going about its day. This one came from Verithold, a farming dome on the equatorial ridge, 300 kilometers from the capital. It reported, in the careful, bloodless language of an agricultural incident log, an unusual soil event affecting the eastern crop terraces. Quarantine protocols initiated as a precaution. Ket read it twice, the way she'd read the redaction twice, and felt the same cold settle a little deeper into her chest. She would come back to the redaction. She told herself that firmly, the way you tell yourself something small can wait, because the alternative was admitting she didn't yet know how frightened she ought to be. She didn't know yet that the two messages sitting side by side on her console that evening were the same thing, wearing two different names, 300 years apart. Halvern Reach sat in high orbit above Iridia, a research station shared, under an old treaty neither government much discussed anymore, by the Sen and a small permanent human delegation. It had been built for patience, long quiet corridors, soft indirect light, archives instead of armories, meeting rooms instead of docking bays large enough for anything more than a shuttle. Ket had grown up on the surface, in the Capitol Dome, in a household that took the continuity doctrine as seriously and as unremarkably as gravity. Her mother had been a records clerk. Her grandmother had been one too. The Sen were, by every measure Ket had ever been taught in her earlier school cycles, the most stable civilization in this arm of the galaxy, unbroken by outside force for 10,000 years, and she had believed that the way you believe the shape of your own hand, without ever really looking at it closely. The doctrine's central law was simple, and to every Sen child it was self-evidently kind. A crisis, once survived, was sealed. Its raw details were removed from common record, the names, the failures, the exact shape of the wound. Only the lesson remained, stripped of the shame that had caused it, gentle enough to be taught to the very young without frightening them. Ket remembered the exact lesson hall on the Capitol Dome's third ring where she had first been taught this, the soft light through the high windows, the instructor's voice as calm and even as Owen's would later become. Grief carried forward becomes a weapon, the instructor had said, more than once, over more than one cycle of schooling. Grief set down becomes a foundation. This is why we are still here, and other people's are not. Ket had written that sentence in her own hand, in her very first workbook, and had believed it so completely that she had never once thought to ask what, precisely, got set down along with the grief. Her mother had kept the Capitol Dome civil records for 30 cycles, a career built almost entirely around the quiet, careful work of deciding what belonged in the permanent account of a citizen's life and what could be allowed to fade from it. Ket remembered asking her, as a child, what happened to the things that were removed. Her mother had smiled, the way adults smile at questions they've decided are too complicated for the person asking them, and said only that removed things went where they belonged, which Ket had understood at the time to mean somewhere safe, and had never once understood, until this week, might simply have meant nowhere at all. Below the reach, Iridia turned slowly under its pale ring of orbital light, its equatorial farming domes strung like beads along the ridge where the atmosphere ran thinnest and the crop terraces caught the most sun. Ket had grown up able to name every dome from orbit by the shape of its light alone. Verithold's light, from this distance, looked exactly like every other dome's. That was, she would later think, the whole trouble with distance. It made everything underneath it look equally safe. We do not carry our wounds forward, her mentor Owen Thess liked to say, in the particular soft voice he used for things he had already said many times before. We carry only what we learned from healing them. Owen was the closest thing Ket had to family on the reach. He had trained her in the vaults since she was young enough to still believe every rule existed for a reason she could see clearly. He was old enough now that his feathers had gone the pale ash grey of the eldest generation, and steady enough that half the archive staff quietly arranged their own schedules around the shape of his calm, the way smaller vessels arrange their courses around something with enough mass to matter. It was Owen she asked, over a shared meal in the staff commons 2 days after Verithold's first report, not to worry about a dome 300 kilometers away. Contaminated irrigation, he said, without quite looking up from his tray. The agricultural office is handling it. They quarantined the whole eastern terrace, Owen, for soil. Farmers overreact when their yields threaten quota standing. He said it lightly, the way you say something you've said many times before and don't expect to be questioned on. You didn't use to dismiss things that easily. That got a small, tired flicker of a smile out of him, gone almost before it arrived. You didn't use to notice when I did. She almost laughed despite herself. It was an old joke between them, the kind that had worn smooth with use, and for a moment things felt ordinary again, the way they had every evening for 4 cycles before that afternoon's redaction had lodged itself under her ribs like a splinter she couldn't quite reach. She let the Verithold question go, because that was what you did with Owen when his voice took on that particular careful evenness, and because she still had a redacted file gnawing quietly at the back of her mind that she hadn't mentioned to anyone yet, not even him. That night, alone in the vault long after the day shift had gone home, she pulled the public record on cycle 300. There had been a difficult period then. The old histories called it the Founder's Grief, taught to every Sen child in their first cycle of schooling as a story about unity in hardship. A dome had failed. The survivors had been resettled among the other colonies. The Sen people had grieved together and moved forward, stronger for having done it as one people instead of many. Ket remembered the illustration from her own schoolbook precisely. Soft grey elders standing together beneath a soft grey sky, hands joined, no faces distinct enough to belong to anyone in particular. That was the whole story. 3 sentences, repeated in every schoolbook she had ever read, never once questioned by anyone she had grown up beside. She searched for the dome's name. It came back withheld under continuity doctrine, cycle 300 provisions, filed under the same flat administrative denial as the Ash Archive cross-reference. She sat with that for a long time, the small green light of her terminal the only thing awake in the vault, and felt, for the first time in her career, the specific discomfort of no longer trusting a rule she had believed in without question her whole life. The joint research treaty that let humans live and work on Halvern Reach also gave archive staff, in theory, cross-species research access to each other's public records. In practice, almost nobody used it. Human records were vast and strange and organized according to conventions that made most Senish archivists' eyes glaze over within the first few minutes of navigating them. Ket had always assumed, without ever quite examining the assumption, that this made them mostly irrelevant to Senish concerns. She filed a research meeting request anyway, flagged low priority, hoping it would move through the system quietly enough that nobody above her paid it any attention at all. The treaty itself had been signed almost 2 full generations earlier, when the first human delegation arrived in this arm of the galaxy with a reputation, even then, for keeping records other species found faintly excessive. Ket's own instructors had described the arrangement, growing up, as a courtesy extended to a young and somewhat overeager species still finding its footing among older civilizations, the kind of polite tolerance one extends to an enthusiastic but harmless neighbor. Nobody Ket had ever studied under had suggested that the arrangement might run in the opposite direction as often as it ran in the one they'd been taught to expect. The human liaison who answered the request was a historian named Dr. Rosalind Cade, a compact, grey-threaded woman who met Ket in a cramped office 3 decks down from the Reach Central Promenade, a room dominated by an enormous, chaotic pile of actual printed paper stacked beside her terminal in a way that made no visible sense to Ket whatsoever. "You keep the physical version," Ket said, before she could stop herself, staring at the pile. "Alongside the digital record." 2 copies of everything important, minimum, Cade said, not looking up from whatever she was annotating. "Sometimes 3. My predecessor used to say a species that only trusts 1 copy of its own history is a species that's never actually lost one." She glanced up, catching Ket's expression, and something like amusement crossed her face. "You're doing the math on how much shelf space that takes across an entire species. Don't. It'll ruin your whole afternoon. How do you even find anything in this office?" "Badly," Cade admitted, with no visible shame at all. "I lost an entire supply requisition under that stack for 4 months last year. Found it eventually, wedged behind a report on a grain shortage from before your species had left your homeworld's atmosphere. My assistant threatened to file a formal complaint against the pile itself. I told him the pile outranks him." She said it dry enough that it took Ket a moment to realize it was meant as a joke, and when she did, something in her chest loosened slightly for the first time since she'd read the redaction. Behind Cade, a narrow observation port looked out on the same slow-turning curve of Iridia that Ket had grown up under, though from up here it looked smaller than she ever expected, more fragile, a single pale arc instead of an entire world. It struck Ket, oddly, that this office belonged to someone who studied disasters for a living and had chosen, out of every possible view, to work with her back to an entire planet's worth of things that could still go wrong on it. Ket found herself almost smiling despite the knot in her stomach. "You study old disasters," she said, by way of getting back to the reason she'd come. "I study everything," Cade said. "Disasters just take up more shelf space than most things." She gestured at the paper pile without any apparent embarrassment, the way someone gestures at a garden they're mildly proud of. This corner's our failure archive. Well, a fraction of it. We keep the whole thing, everywhere, on every world we've settled. Every collapse. Every plague. Every war we lost outright. None of it gets erased. Ket blinked. Nothing at all. Nothing. Cade said it the way someone describes a fact of geography, not a philosophy she'd had to argue herself into. We used to try forgetting things, a long time ago. Different eras, different reasons, grief, embarrassment, politics. Turned out forgetting doesn't make the mistake stop happening. It just means the next generation gets to discover it fresh, at full cost, without any of the warning the last generation already paid for. Ket found herself staring at the paper pile as if it might do something unexpected. I'm looking for something called the Ash Archive, she said finally, deciding there was no version of this conversation that didn't require honesty somewhere near the start. It's referenced in a Senish record from 300 cycles ago. The reference itself is denied. I don't know what it contains. I'm not entirely sure why it's ours to deny in the first place. Something shifted behind Cade's expression, small and quick, not surprise exactly, more like the recognition of a door she hadn't expected anyone to knock on, not this year, maybe not this decade. The Ash Archive is ours, Cade said slowly, setting down her stylus. It's not classified, on our end. It's just old, and heavy, and not the kind of thing people generally ask for on a slow Tuesday. She studied Ket for a long moment, the way Ket imagined a physician studies a scan before deciding what to say about it out loud. Why do you want it? Ket hesitated. The honest answer would sound, spoken out loud, like an open accusation against her own government, offered to someone who wasn't Senish at all. She gave it anyway. Because I think my people already lived through whatever is happening at Verithold right now, 300 cycles ago. And I think we erased how we survived it, so thoroughly that nobody currently in a position to make decisions even remembers there's something worth remembering. Cade didn't say anything for a moment. Then she pulled her terminal toward herself and began composing an access request, her fingers moving with the unhurried, practiced certainty of someone who had done something like this before and fully expected to do it again in her lifetime. I'll need formal sign-off from your council for a proper transfer, she said. That's just procedure, ours and yours both. But I can show you the plain summary right now. No sign-off needed for that. It isn't secret. It's just heavy, and most people don't ask to carry it. Why does it need a name at all? Ket asked. Ash Archive. It sounds deliberate. Cade considered that for a moment, the way someone considers a question they've been asked before but never quite answered the same way twice. Because ash is what's left after something burns all the way down, she said. We could have called it something gentler. We didn't want anyone opening it expecting comfort. If you go looking for the Ash Archive, you already know, before you open the first file, exactly what kind of read you're in for. Nobody stumbles into it by accident. We don't have a name like that for anything, Ket said quietly. We don't have a word, in our own language, for a place where the worst things are kept on purpose. Maybe you will, by the time this is over, Cade said, and did not say it unkindly, which somehow made it land harder than if she had. The summary alone took an hour to read, and Ket read it twice, slowly, the way you read something you suspect is about to change what you think you know. The Ash Archive, Cade explained, sitting across from her with the patience of someone who had clearly walked other people through the same material before, was the complete and unedited record of a plague that had killed nearly a third of humanity's population on their homeworld, long before they had ever left it. Every failed treatment was documented, in full, including the ones that had made things measurably worse. Every wrong call made by every government body involved was named, specifically, alongside the names of the individuals who had made them. Every count of the dead sat in the record broken down by region, by age, by cause, exactly as it had been tallied at the time, without softening, without rounding to a gentler number for anyone's comfort. You don't erase the names, Ket said. She meant it as a question, and it came out sounding closer to disbelief. We used to argue about that for generations, Cade said. Whether it was cruel to the families, keeping an administrator's failure attached to his name forever, long after he was gone and couldn't defend himself anymore. We decided, eventually, it would be crueler to let the next crisis land on people who didn't know, in exact numbers and exact names, what the last one had actually cost. She shrugged, A small human gesture Ket still hadn't fully gotten used to. Shame fades on its own, given enough time. Data doesn't, as long as you keep it honest. Ket sat with that for a long moment, feeling something in her carefully arranged understanding of her own culture come loose at one corner, the way a shelf tile comes loose before you notice the whole section beneath it has already shifted. We seal our disasters, she said quietly. We remove the details entirely. We keep only the lesson, softened enough to teach to children. How do you know the lesson's the right one? Kate asked, not unkindly, if nobody's allowed to check it against what actually happened. Ket didn't have an answer. She hadn't needed one, before that afternoon. One entry stayed with her longer than the rest, a short note buried in the middle of the summary, attached to a containment method that had been tried and had failed on its very first attempt, killing a dozen people it had been meant to save. The entry didn't excuse the failure or bury it in careful language. It simply recorded what had gone wrong, in plain terms, and what had been changed the second time as a result. There was no name attached to praise, and no name attached to blame beyond the simple statement of who had made the call and why. It read less like an accusation and more like a debt honestly paid, the debt of being remembered accurately, owed to the people who hadn't survived long enough to have any say in how their deaths were written down. Doesn't it hurt? Ket asked quietly, reading your own history like this. All of it laid out so plainly. Every time, Kate said. That's rather the point of keeping it that way. If it stopped hurting to read, we'd probably stop reading it carefully enough to notice when we were about to do it again. Later, back in the staff commons, ISS found her staring at nothing over a cold meal and asked, lightly, whether the research hole had swallowed her whole yet. Something like that, Ket said. Anything you can talk about. Ket looked at her friend for a long moment, and understood, with a small ache, that the honest answer was no, not yet, maybe not for a while, and that this was the first real secret she had ever kept from someone she genuinely liked. Not yet, she said instead. Ask me again in a few days. She lay awake a long time that night turning over a question she had never once had reason to ask before that week. What, exactly, was she risking, and for whom? Not for herself. She understood, with a kind of distant clarity, that her own career would likely survive whatever came next, however uncomfortable it became. Not entirely for Verithold either, not yet, not while its danger was still an abstraction 300 kilometers away instead of a face she'd have to look at. She realized, somewhere near the deepest part of that sleepless night, that what she was actually risking everything for was much smaller and much stranger than either of those things. The simple, stubborn conviction that a rule which required forgetting the dead in order to protect the living had never been mercy at all, only the appearance of it, worn smooth by 10,000 years of nobody looking closely enough to tell the difference. That night, back in her own quarters, staring at the ceiling instead of sleeping, she filed a second, quieter request, not through the official council channel this time, but directly to Cade, for full unrestricted access to the Ash Archive's medical containment section, the part most likely to bear on a blight event. She marked it personal correspondence, not archive business, and told herself this was simply thoroughness, the ordinary diligence of a careful researcher, not the beginning of something she wouldn't be able to walk back from later. She didn't tell Owen. That, more than anything else she did that week, felt like stepping over a line whose other side she genuinely couldn't see yet. 3 days later, Verithold's quarantine status changed on the public boards from contained to critical, and the Agricultural Office stopped answering questions from anyone outside the council entirely. The council called it sealing. Ket had heard the word her whole life and never once thought carefully about what it actually meant, because it had always been something that happened to old crises, safely finished, safely in the past tense, printed in soft-edged illustrations in schoolbooks. It meant something entirely different when it was about to happen to a living dome with 400 people still breathing inside it. She learned the difference from Owen, in the vault, late, in a voice she had never once heard him use in 4 cycles of working beside him. Tired, and careful, and old in a way that had nothing to do with the color of his feathers. Verithold's contamination has crossed the threshold the council considers unrecoverable, he said, not meeting her eyes. Evacuation of essential personnel begins at first light tomorrow. The dome will be isolated. Its records, once the event concludes, will be processed under standard continuity provisions. Processed, Ket repeated. You mean erased. I mean protected, Owen said, and for the first time she heard real strain underneath his usual calm, a crack running through the middle of a voice she had trusted her whole career. This is not new. This is not the first time our people have faced something like this. She went very still. What happened 300 cycles ago, Owen? Tell me. Please. He didn't answer right away. In the silence, she watched something in him give way slowly, the way a wall finally gives after holding back water for far longer than it was ever built to. There was a dome, he said finally, his voice barely above the hum of the vault's cooling fans. Cycle 300. A blight, in the crop terraces, spreading faster than anyone at the time understood how to contain. The council of that era believed full containment was impossible with the tools they had. They sealed the dome, to protect the rest of the colony network from what they feared would spread further. 4,000 people, Ket. Not resettled. Sealed, with the dome, and the details of the failure sealed along with them. He was quiet for a moment, looking at something that wasn't in the room with them anymore. I read the unredacted account once, as an apprentice, before the last copy of it was finally destroyed rather than merely locked. There was a broadcast, in the final hours, from someone inside the dome who understood what was coming. Not a plea. A record. She spoke for nearly an hour, listing names, ages, what each of them had been working on before the blight reached the residential ring, so that someone, somewhere, would at least know they had existed as more than a single sealed number in a schoolbook illustration. I do not know if anyone outside that dome ever heard the whole broadcast before it was ordered destroyed. His voice had gone very quiet. I have never been able to forget that I know it happened, even though I am no longer permitted to know any of the names she gave. Why didn't you ever tell me? Ket asked. In 4 cycles. Why now? Because until 3 days ago, it was a story about the past, Owen said. A closed wound, the way the doctrine promised it would be. I told myself the kindest thing I could do, for you and for the woman whose voice I still remember better than I remember my own mother's, was to let the wound stay closed, since nothing I said could open it without cost to someone. I did not understand, until Verith Hold, that a wound left closed by force does not heal. It simply waits for the next thing sharp enough to reopen it. Ket felt the floor of her understanding tilt, slow and sickening, like a deck shifting under an unexpected swell. You knew, she said. This whole time. You've always known. I was young when I learned it, still an apprentice, barely older than you are now. Young enough that I convinced myself the mercy of forgetting was worth what it cost. I told myself that story for 40 cycles, Ket. I have gotten very good at telling it. His voice cracked, just slightly, on the word mercy, like something under too much old pressure finally finding a hairline fracture. I did not know, when I told it to you at meals and called it comfort, that I would ever have to watch it happen a second time. And now there's a second dome, Ket said, hearing her own voice go flat and hard in a way that frightened her a little, with the same blight, and the council is about to do exactly the same thing to it, because nobody kept the details that might have stopped it the first time from ever being needed again. Owen didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was answer enough, and it was the loudest thing Ket had ever heard him say in 4 cycles of quiet mornings together. She stood, her hands shaking in a way she hadn't felt since she was a child, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than the redaction ever had, that she was not going to wait quietly for anyone's permission to try to stop this from happening a second time. She went back to Cade that same night, well past the hour any reasonable person would expect a research request, and this time she didn't soften a single word of it. The council is going to seal Verith Hold, she said, the door barely closed behind her. The same way they sealed a dome 300 cycles ago. Full erasure of the place and everyone left inside it, once the event concludes. I need the Ash Archives containment data. All of it, now, not through formal channels. Channels will take longer than that dome has left to wait. Cade didn't hesitate the way Ket had half expected, half feared, that she would. It's already prepared, she said, turning her terminal around without ceremony. I pulled the full containment section after your last request came in. Something about the way you asked told me you'd be back sooner than a formal transfer could ever move. She paused, and for a moment something more personal crossed her face. My own grandmother lived through the last outbreak we ever had like this, on a colony world I've never even visited. She used to say the worst thing anyone ever did for her, growing up, was try to protect her from knowing exactly what it had cost. She said not knowing made her braver in all the wrong ways, and more frightened in all the wrong ones too. She spent the last 20 years of her own career helping write entries into the Ash Archive herself, interviewing survivors, getting the numbers exact, sitting with families who wanted their relatives' names spelled correctly even when nothing else about the record was kind. She used to say it was the least comfortable work she ever did, and the only work she was ever completely certain had been worth doing. Did she ever regret it? Any of it? Once, Cade said. She told me about a woman she'd interviewed who begged her not to include her husband's name, because he'd been the administrator who delayed the quarantine order those 9 critical hours, and she didn't want her children growing up under that. My grandmother included it anyway. She told me, years later, it was the only decision from her whole career she still lost sleep over, and the one she was still certain, even so, had been correct. Cade looked at Ket steadily. I tell you that so you understand I'm not handing this to you lightly, or without knowing what it can cost the people who keep it. I'm handing it to you because the alternative costs more. Ket looked at the file. It was plain, undecorated, titled with the flat clinical honesty Cade's people apparently applied to everything. Cycle report, Halvorsen blight, containment failure, and eventual protocol. It was the record of humanity's own worst agricultural collapse, generations back, on a colony world whose name meant nothing to Ket and whose suffering, documented in complete and unflinching detail, was about to mean everything. It named the scientists who guessed wrong, first, and kept guessing wrong for weeks. It named the regional administrator who delayed quarantine by 9 critical hours because he didn't want to be the one who confirmed, publicly, that the crop failure was real and not a temporary anomaly. It listed the number of dead, settlement by settlement, without a single figure rounded for comfort. And near the end of the file, it listed the protocol that had finally worked, not a cure, but a precise containment method, built out of every earlier failure, specific enough that Ket could read it and see immediately, with a kind of sick clarity, exactly why the Council's current approach to Verith-Hold would fail in almost exactly the way the Halvorsen response had failed its first 6 attempts. Ket scrolled further, past the worst of the death counts, into the section that documented the public response at the time. The arguments in government chambers, not unlike the one she imagined was probably assembling right now, 300 kilometers below her, to decide Verith-Hold's fate. Half the officials quoted in the old record had argued for exactly what the Senate Council was arguing for now. Contain what can be saved, seal what cannot, protect the larger whole by accepting the smaller loss. The other half had argued the opposite, and lost that argument the first several times. At a cost measured in names, Ket now found herself unable to stop reading. You're simply giving me this, Ket said slowly. All of it. The names, the mistakes, everything that makes your own history look its worst. It already happened, Cade said, simply, without any weight of performance in it at all. Hiding it now wouldn't undo a single death in it. It would just mean someone else, somewhere, has to make the same mistake blind, the way we did the first time through it. She looked at Ket steadily. You needed this before your sealing order clears. So here it is. Take all of it. Don't ask me to explain what it cost my people to write it down honestly the first time. I wasn't there for that part. I only inherited the responsibility of keeping it kept. Ket sat with the open file in front of her for a long moment, and felt, for the first time in her life, genuinely afraid of how much smaller her own government's version of mercy looked, standing next to this. Ket went down to the surface herself, 2 days later, telling no one on the Reach where she was going, using a research travel permit that was, technically, still valid for exactly this kind of visit. Verith-Hold from ground level looked nothing like the small, uniform light Ket had grown used to seeing from orbit. It was a working dome, its outer ring given over almost entirely to crop terraces stepped in wide shallow tiers, green shading to a dry, worrying grey along the eastern edge where the quarantine tape had already gone up. The air inside smelled of turned soil and irrigation coolant, and underneath both, faint but unmistakable if you knew to look for it, a bitter mineral note that hadn't been there, according to the old logs, until the 3rd week of the outbreak. She found Prell in the dome's small medical office, a woman not much older than Ket herself, sitting very still in front of a monitor covered in numbers that clearly weren't improving. Prell looked up when Ket introduced herself as an archive researcher, and did not bother hiding how little that meant to her in the middle of what she was dealing with. An archivist, Prell repeated, with the particular flatness of someone who has been asked one too many pointless questions that week. What exactly does an archivist think they can do for 400 people with a blight nobody's ever successfully treated? I don't know yet, Ket admitted. I might be able to find something that helps. I might not. I wanted to see the dome before I decided how hard to try. Something in Prell's face shifted, not quite trust, but the recognition of someone who hadn't come to offer comfort she couldn't back up. Most of the people who've come through here in the last week wanted to see the dome so they could write an accurate report about how it failed, she said. You're the first one who said it like you still think it might not. She walked Ket through the affected terraces herself, past withering rows that had been thick and green 3 weeks earlier, past workers in thin protective wraps who nodded at Prell with the particular exhausted respect of people who trusted her completely and were frightened anyway. In the residential ring, children were still being sent to lessons, on the dome administrator's orders, because normal routines were considered better for morale than the alternative, and Ket found she couldn't decide whether that decision was wisdom or the same kind of careful, well-meant blindness that had cost a different dome everything 300 cycles earlier. They passed a small memorial marker near the dome's central junction, newly placed, listing nothing more than a date and a single line about ongoing hope for recovery, the standard language the Agricultural Office issued for any active incident, vague enough to mean almost anything. Ket stopped in front of it longer than she meant to. That's not for anyone who's died, Prell said, watching her look at it. Not yet. It's precautionary. The administrator had it installed the same day the quarantine went up, before we even knew how bad it would get. She said it without any particular emotion, the way you describe a piece of standard equipment. I used to think that was practical planning. Lately I've started to wonder if it's the same instinct that leads to sealing a dome before anyone's actually decided the loss is unavoidable. Preparing for the worst so thoroughly that you stop working quite as hard to prevent it. If it comes to sealing, Ket asked quietly, as they stood at the edge of the worst affected terrace, what happens to all of this? To you, to them. I've read the old provisions, Prell said. Everyone in my position has, whether we are told to or not. It's not resettlement. Whatever they call it in the reports, it isn't resettlement. She looked out at her dying terraces for a long moment. I would like it very much if you found something in your archive, Archivist Aran. I would like it even more if you found it in time. Ket carried that sentence with her the entire flight back to the Reach, and it was still sitting in her chest, heavier than anything Vash Oren would later say to her, when she went back to Cade's office that same evening. She should have expected the summons. She hadn't, and that was its own small lesson in how far outside her usual life she had already wandered. Councillor Vash Oren received her in a narrow administrative office on the Reach's upper ring, a room with none of the warmth of Cade's cluttered corner and none of the comfortable dust of the deep vault. Vash was old enough to remember a council session or two before Ket had been born, and she did not raise her voice even once, which somehow made the conversation harder to sit through than shouting would have been. You filed a personal research request with the Terran delegation, Vash said, not as an accusation exactly, more as a fact laid carefully on the table between them. Regarding a cross-reference the council marked closed 300 cycles ago. I filed a request regarding an active blight event, Ket said. The cross-reference happened to be attached to it. Do not do that, Vash said, quietly, and for the first time something almost like weariness showed through the careful evenness of her voice. Do not pretend you found this by accident and are simply following where the data led. I have read your query logs. You went looking for Cycle 300 before Verith Hold had produced a single case worth investigating. Ket said nothing, because there was nothing honest to say that wouldn't make things worse. You think we hide our failures out of cowardice, Vash went on. I understand why it looks that way from where you're standing. It has never looked that way from where I stand. 10,000 years, Archivist Aran. 10,000 years without civil collapse, without the kind of grief that fractures a people permanently into factions who can never trust each other again. Do you know what holds a species together that long? Not truth. Truth is a young species luxury. It's continuity. It's agreeing, generation after generation, not to reopen wounds that would otherwise never stop bleeding. Outside the narrow window behind Vash's desk, Ket could see a thin sliver of Iridia's curve, the same view she'd grown up under, and found herself thinking, oddly, of her mother's civil records office, of every quiet decision about what counted as worth keeping that had been made by people exactly like the woman sitting across from her now, all of them certain, in the moment, that they were choosing kindness over cruelty. The humans are not that young, Ket said. They keep everything, and they're still standing. They are standing on a homeworld they very nearly lost outright, by their own account, more than once, Vash said. I have read the same summary you have, Archivist. I read it 3 cycles ago, when the treaty was first drafted, and I concluded then what I still conclude now, that a species willing to relive its worst moment in full detail, generation after generation, is a species that has simply not yet discovered what that kind of remembering eventually costs them. Perhaps they never will. Perhaps their grief metabolizes differently than ours does. I am not willing to gamble 10,000 years of Senish continuity on the hope that our grief works the same way theirs does. And if it doesn't cost them anything at all, Ket said. If the only thing it costs is our own comfort in not having to look at it. Vash's expression didn't change, but something in the set of her shoulders did, fractionally, the way a person shifts weight before admitting an argument has landed somewhere they'd rather it hadn't. And if the wound is still open, Ket said, underneath the bandage you put over it 300 years ago? What holds then? Vash was quiet for a long moment, and something in her expression suggested this was not the first time she had asked herself the same question, alone, late at night, and simply chosen not to answer it. Verith Hold will be sealed according to protocol, she said finally. I am sorry for what that costs you personally. I am not sorry for the law itself. It has served us longer than either of us has been alive. She rose, indicating the meeting was over, then paused with one hand on the edge of her desk, and for just a moment something older and less certain showed through the careful evenness she had worn through the entire conversation. I was young once too, Archivist. Younger than you, even. I asked a question very like the one you are asking now, about a much smaller thing, and I was told, gently, by someone I trusted, that some doors are locked for reasons kinder than curiosity can usually see from the outside. I believed her. I have spent the rest of my career being grateful that I did. She looked at Ket for a long moment. I find, this week, that I am no longer entirely certain gratitude was the correct thing to have felt. I would advise you to close whatever channel you've opened with the humans, Archivist, she said, more quietly now, before it closes something far more important instead. Ket left without agreeing to anything, and without telling Vash that the channel was, at that very moment, already sitting open on her terminal 3 decks below, with a file in it that made every argument Vash had just made sound smaller than it had an hour before. The sealing order came through at first light the next morning, faster than Ket had let herself expect, faster than she was anywhere near ready for. She had, by the medical officer's own estimate, perhaps 6 hours before the containment crews reached Verith Hold's outer lock, and the protocol in her hands needed at least 4 of those hours just to synthesize the compound the old human record described, using equipment the dome's small medical bay had never been built to handle. She went to Oven first, because she needed the Vault's authorization codes to release medical override access to a civilian dome under active council quarantine, and because some old, stubborn part of her still wanted him to be the one who said yes to this, out loud, before anyone else did. He looked at the file for a long time on her outstretched terminal. Longer than she expected, long enough that she nearly reached to take it back. This will be treated as a formal continuity violation, he said quietly, at last. Sharing sealed adjacent knowledge with unsanctioned personnel. Circumventing an active council order during a live crisis, no less. They will not be gentle about this, Ket. Not with either of us, this time. I know. They were not gentle with me, once, a long time ago, for asking the wrong question at the wrong moment. I stopped asking questions like that, after. I told myself, for 40 cycles, that this was wisdom, and not simply fear wearing a calmer face. He looked up at her at last, and something in his old, tired eyes had finally, completely given way. I do not want you to spend the next 40 cycles of your own life telling yourself that same lie, the way I did mine. He entered the codes himself, his hands steadier than she expected them to be. The first obstacle came almost immediately, before she'd even reached the transit bay to relay the file down to Verith Hold's medical office. A routine security flag caught the size of the transfer and froze it automatically, pending manual review, the kind of safeguard designed to catch exactly the sort of unsanctioned bulk data movement Ket was attempting. She stood in the empty corridor outside the transit bay for 4 minutes that felt considerably longer, watching a small spinning icon do nothing at all, before Oven's own long-standing archive credentials, entered from his terminal 2 decks away without a word of explanation to whoever might have been watching the logs, cleared the flag manually and let the file through. The next 4 hours were the longest of Ket's life. She stood in Verith Hold's cramped medical bay over a comm channel that kept threatening to drop entirely, walking a terrified junior physician named Prell through a synthesis process built from a report written about an entirely different crop, on an entirely different world, generations before either of them had been born. Every substitution had to be translated, adapted, argued over sentence by sentence, because the human protocol had never once been designed with Senish biology in mind, and every shortcut risked killing the very people it was meant to save. Through the open comm channel, Ket could hear the medical bay around Prell almost as clearly as if she was standing in it, equipment never designed for this kind of synthesis whining under strain, someone else in the background reading out temperature figures in a voice pulled tight with fear, and underneath all of it, faint through the walls, the low murmur of 400 people who did not yet know how close the decision to save them had come to arriving too late. "This ratio is wrong for our enzymes," Prell said at one point, voice tight with something close to panic. "It will bind to the wrong receptor entirely." "Then adjust it," Ket said, pulling the raw failure data back up, scanning past the summary to the actual numbers underneath. "They tried the wrong ratio first too. Look, third attempt, page 40. They overcorrected here, then undercorrected on the fifth try. Split the difference between the two and match it to our binding coefficient." There was a long pause on the line, filled with the small sounds of someone working very fast under very bad pressure. That might actually work. It already did, once, for someone else. That's the whole point of writing it down. Somewhere behind Prell's voice, Ket could hear another member of the medical staff quietly running the numbers a second time, double-checking her adjustment before committing the batch to synthesis, and found herself grateful, in a way she hadn't expected, for a colleague she would probably never meet who was careful enough not to simply trust a stranger's math on the strength of a good feeling alone. Twice, the compound failed to bind correctly under the dome's limited equipment. Twice, Ket went back to the raw human data, the exact failed attempts, the exact numbers, laid out without apology or embarrassment in the old record, and found, buried in someone else's centuries-old mistake, precisely the adjustment she needed to correct her own. Prell's voice came back on the channel once more, quieter this time, almost apologetic. "If this third batch fails the way the first two did, we won't have time to try a fourth. The terraces on the north side are already past the point the old records call recoverable." "Then it won't fail," Ket said, with a conviction she didn't entirely feel, and went back through the numbers one more time, checking the binding coefficient against every failed attempt in the human record until she found the one detail she'd missed the first two times through, a temperature threshold, noted almost in passing in the old report, that the Halvorsen team hadn't identified as critical until their fourth attempt. 3 centuries, and 1 galaxy away. "Raise the mixture 2 degrees, she said. "Just 2. Hold it there for the last minute of synthesis, not the whole cycle." There was a pause, and then the sound of someone adjusting a control she couldn't see. "Holding," Prell said. "Ket, if this doesn't work." "It will," Ket said, and made herself believe it, because there was no time left to do anything else. The containment crews reached Verithold's outer lock 40 minutes before the third batch of compound was ready. Ket stood at the console, sweat cold along her collar ridge, and did the only thing left that she could think to do. She opened a channel straight into the council chamber, patched through every archive terminal she still had clearance for, and read the sealing order's own founding language back to the assembled council, the clause, buried deep in ancient Senish law, that required a formal review period before any dome housing living Sen could be lawfully sealed. Vash's voice came back over the channel, tight and furious and, underneath it, unmistakably afraid. "You are invoking a review clause that has not been used in over 200 cycles." "It's still law," Ket said. "You taught me that yourself, Counselor. We don't erase our laws, only our failures." It bought her 31 minutes. It was, in the end, exactly enough. Verithold held. The compound worked fully on its third batch, slower than anyone in that medical bay would have liked, fast enough that the blight spread stopped 6 hours before it would have crossed into the dome's central residential ring. Prell's voice, when it finally came back over the channel, sounded less like the trained physician who had spent 4 hours arguing over reagent ratios and more like someone who had simply forgotten, for a moment, how to speak at a normal volume. "It's holding," she said, twice, as though she needed to hear herself say it before she could believe it applied to her own dome and not someone else's. It's holding." Ket sat down on the floor of the vault, right where she was, because her legs had stopped being entirely reliable, and allowed herself, for the first time in 4 hours, to feel exactly how frightened she had been the entire time she'd been too busy to notice it. 400 people who would otherwise have been sealed away along with the rest of the record walked out of quarantine 11 days later, into ordinary, unremarkable daylight, most of them not yet fully aware of how narrow the margin had actually been. Ket went down to see the terraces one more time before the council's review began in earnest. Prell met her at the same edge of the same field, though the field itself looked different now. The grey-dying rows had been cut back, and beneath them, faint but unmistakable, the first pale green of new growth had begun to show. Prell didn't say very much. She simply stood beside Ket for a while, watching the same view they'd watched together in far worse circumstances, and at some point reached over and gripped Ket's hand once, briefly, the way you thank someone for something too large to fit into an actual sentence. The council's formal review of what had happened took considerably longer than 11 days. Ket was called before them 3 separate times. She told them everything, in order, without editing any of it for her own comfort. The redaction she'd found by accident, the quiet request she'd filed without telling anyone, the file Kate had handed her without a moment's hesitation, the sealing order she had delayed by nothing more than reading their own ancient law back at them in their own chamber. She did not soften a single part of it, because she had spent one very long week learning, from a species that kept its worst mistakes on plain, unashamed permanent record, that softening a true account only ever made the next mistake harder for someone else to prevent. In the second session, one of the younger counselors, a sharp-eyed administrator named Toril who had voted for the sealing order without hesitation, asked her directly whether she believed the continuity doctrine itself was the failure, or only its application to Verith Hold. Ket considered the question longer than she considered most things and more. "I think the doctrine was built by people who were trying to be kind to the living," she said. "I don't think anyone who wrote it imagined it would eventually mean the dead couldn't be trusted to teach us anything either. I don't think unkindness was ever the intention. I think it became the result anyway, the way a bandage left on too long stops protecting a wound and starts causing a new one." Toril didn't answer that, but she didn't look away from Ket for a long moment afterward, and something in her expression suggested the question hadn't been rhetorical after all. In the third session, Owen was called to testify as well, and did so without once trying to soften his own part in what had happened. He told the council, plainly, that he had known about cycle 300 for 40 cycles and had never once raised it, not out of fear of punishment, but out of a much quieter fear that he had never examined closely enough to name until the week Verith Hold nearly followed the same dome into silence. "I have spent 40 cycles believing that my silence was a form of respect for the dead," he told them. "I no longer believe that. I believe it was simply easier than the alternative, and I mistook ease for wisdom for longer than I am comfortable admitting in this chamber." Vash Oren sat through all 3 sessions without once raising her voice, and asked, at the end of the last one, a single question that surprised everyone in the room, Ket included. "If you had asked me formally, through proper channels, before any of this began," Vash said, "would I have granted the access you needed?" Ket thought about it honestly, the way the last week had taught her to think about most things now. "No," she said. "I don't think you would have. I think you would have believed, the same way you believe now, that granting it would cost us something more valuable than 400 lives were worth risking to find out." Vash was quiet for a long moment. "That is the most honest answer anyone has given this council in longer than I care to admit." She did not smile, exactly, but something in her old face eased, fractionally, like a held breath finally let go. "It does not entirely excuse what you did. It does, I think, explain why I am no longer certain the law you broke was worth protecting in the shape it currently holds." The council did not thank her outright, not that day. Councils rarely do, in the moment, when the mirror they're being handed shows them something they'd rather not have seen quite so clearly. 3 months later, a new provision was added to the continuity doctrine, quietly, without any formal announcement, in the way most real change inside a very old institution tends to arrive, not as a declaration, but as a small line added to a much larger document that most people would never read closely enough to notice at all. Crisis records would no longer be sealed automatically upon resolution. They would be kept complete, difficult names and hard numbers included, in a new section of the long shelf that Ket herself, somewhat to her own disbelief, was asked to oversee. She named the new section, with the council's visibly reluctant approval, the Verith Record. It was the first fully honest account of a Senish disaster committed to permanent memory in 300 cycles. Owen came to see it on the day it formally opened to general access. He stood for a long time in front of the entry terminal, reading the names of the administrators who had ordered the first sealing, 3 centuries before either of them had been born, names that had never once appeared in any schoolbook either of them had grown up with. "It is not comfortable," he said finally, quietly, "seeing it written down like this, in full." "No," Ket agreed. "I don't think it's meant to be comfortable. I think that might be the entire point of it." He was quiet for a while, watching the name scroll slowly past. Then he asked the question she had half expected him to ask since cycle 300 stopped being a rumor to her and became a fact she couldn't unlearn. "Do you think the humans ever asked us for anything, in return, for what they gave us? Access to something of our own we'd sealed, as a form of fair payment?" Ket had wondered the same thing herself, and had finally asked Kay directly about it, the week before, over the same cluttered desk where all of this had begun. I asked her exactly that, she said. She told me they never once requested reciprocal access to anything of ours that had been sealed. Not formally, not even quietly, off the record. When I asked her why not, she said something I haven't stopped turning over since. What did she say? She said, "We didn't give it to you so you'd owe us something back. We gave it to you because it was sitting on a shelf doing nothing at all, and your people were dying without it. If you ever want to give something back for it, don't give it to us. Give it to the next people who need it more than either of us do right now." ISS found her in the vault later that same week, standing in front of the same terminal, and read the Verith Records opening entry over her shoulder without asking permission, the way old friends eventually earn the right to. "You could have told me," ISS said, when she'd finished reading. "Back when you first found the redaction. I would have helped. You told me to leave it forgotten. I told you that because I assumed you'd get us both fined for improper archive conduct, not because I actually wanted you to listen." ISS bumped her shoulder against Ket's, lightly, the old familiar gesture between them that had never needed words attached to it. "Next time you find something with no category at all, tell me first. I'd rather get fined alongside you than find out after the fact that you nearly got sealed into a farming dome without me." "There won't be a next time like this one," Ket said. "There's always a next time," ISS said, not unkindly. "That's rather the whole point of what you just built, isn't it? Somewhere to keep it, so the next person doesn't have to find out the hard way, alone, at 2 a.m, the way you did." Owen looked at the open terminal for a long moment, at the names, at the exact unrounded numbers, at the plain, unflinching record of a mistake his own government had spent 300 cycles quietly pretending had never happened at all. "That is a strange kind of strength," he said at last, very quietly. "Keeping your worst moments where anyone at all can go and look at them, forever." "I think," Ket said, watching the same name scroll past, "that's exactly what it is. Not hiding what happened, the way we always have. Just refusing, on principle, to let it happen the same way twice." Somewhere below them, in a farming dome that had come within 40 minutes of becoming nothing more than a sealed name in an old law, 400 people were bringing in a harvest that had almost never grown again. None of them would ever read the old human record that had quietly saved their lives, written by strangers on a world none of them would ever visit, about a disaster none of them would ever have to live through firsthand. None of them needed to read it. It had already done exactly what it was built to do. Prel sent Ket a short message the week the harvest came in, the kind of message that arrives without any ceremony attached to it, the way most genuinely important messages do. It said only that the North Terraces had come back a pale, stubborn green, and that a child born the week of the outbreak had been named, by her parents, after no one in particular, but after a season instead, the word for early planting, in the old Senish farming dialect, chosen because her parents had wanted her to carry forward something that had almost been lost rather than something that had almost been forgotten. Ket read it twice, the way she seemed to read everything now, and filed it, without quite deciding to, in the same section of her memory where she kept the sound of Owen's voice cracking on the word mercy, and the particular stillness of Vash Oren's face in the third testimony, and the plain, undecorated title of a report about a plague on a world she would probably never see with her own eyes. The Verith record grew slowly over the following cycles, the way honest records tend to, one difficult entry at a time rather than all at once. Ket added the Ash Archives Halvorsen report to it as well, in full, with a short note at the front explaining, in plain administrative language, exactly how it had come to be there and what it had cost to bring it home in time. She did not soften that part either. Vash Oren visited the new section only once that Ket ever witnessed, late, alone, long after the general staff had gone for the evening. She didn't stay long, and she didn't say anything to Ket about what she'd read. She left, instead, a short formal note attached to the records charter, granting it permanent standing under council law rather than the provisional status it had been given at first, the kind of change that required real political cost to make and drew no attention at all when it happened. Ket understood, reading it, that this was the closest thing to an apology she was ever likely to receive from that particular direction, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it was enough. Cade came to see the record too, eventually, on one of her rare visits down to the surface, and stood for a while beside Ket in front of the same entry terminal Owen had once found so uncomfortable to look at directly. "It's a good start," she said, after a long silence. "It won't stay comfortable to read. That's how you'll know you're doing it correctly." "How long did it take your people?" Ket asked, before it stopped feeling like something you were doing wrong. We are still working on that part, Kate said, and there was nothing evasive in the answer at all, only the plain, unhurried honesty Kate had come, over these last months, to recognize as the truest thing about her. I don't think it's supposed to stop feeling like that, entirely. I think you just get better at doing it anyway. They stood together a while longer, watching the entry scroll slowly past, names, numbers, the exact shape of a mistake finally allowed to exist in the open where the next person who needed it could actually find it. Kate thought, not for the first time that season, about the redaction that had started all of this, the flat administrative wall with nothing behind it but the absence of a question. She understood now, in a way she hadn't when she'd first found it, that the wall had never really been protecting the dead at all. It had only ever been protecting the living from having to look at what protecting them had cost. She did not say that part out loud to Kate. She didn't need to. It was already sitting there, plainly, in the record itself, for anyone willing to read it. It had already done exactly what it was built to do, quietly, honestly, and precisely once, because for once, on this occasion, nobody had bothered to bury it where the next crisis could never find it again.